Welcome back to another episode of A Gift from Adversity. My name is Juri. I'm your host. Today we're recording episode 84. And I'm very excited to have today's guest. But before I introduce my guest, I want to introduce my book, which is the same title as this podcast, A Gift from Adversity by Juri. It's available on Amazon. This subtitle is Overcoming Sexual Abuse, Domestic Violence, Bullying, and Homelessness. And after I published my book, I've gotten a lot of messages from all over the world, people sharing the Me Too movement, sharing the stories. And I felt very compelled to create a platform where people can share their adversities, but not only that, the tools that they use to overcome and a gift that came from it. And I'm very excited to continue this dialogue and normalize the difficult conversations and share the tools that we can provide to us, but also for our next generations. So let's invite our guest. Thank you, Dan, so much for coming.
Yes, you're welcome. I'm greatly appreciated to share my message and hopefully provide some inspiration and hope, because those are two major fuels, right, that we all need today.
Sure. So let's introduce you by saying our audience your name, where you're coming in from, and what you do, and if you have a website and social media.
Sure. My name is Dan Hegerich. I'm in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which is the Berkshires, the western part of the state. And essentially, I'm a 6-time cancer survivor that turned a heroic life and wellness coach and an expert in natural health and conscious healing. And now I'm just here to share the message of that challenge that I faced, or that adversity of having a cancer 6 times.
And do you have a website or social media people can check it out?
Yes, I do. So my website is danhegerich.com, Dan, Hegerich.com. I also have a podcast called Do the Cure, and Do the Cure is an acronym. Do the Cure is in an acronym. It kind of protects me from the powers to be from using the word cure. So it's C.U.R.E. And you can find me on Facebook under danhegerich.com or Daniel Hegerich on Facebook. I do have others, but I'm mostly active on Facebook.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that, Dan. So let's dive into our first question, which is the adversity. So what was your adversity?
So it was essentially living an inauthentic life. I think that was the highest level I could say adversity, because I went to school to become a civil engineer, and I became a civil engineer. And then every day just felt wrong, like being an engineer. It was just a struggle. I was trying to become a professional engineer. And it wasn't until 6 years into that engineering practice that I became ill with terminal cancer. Okay. So it seems like the cancer would have been the adversity, but it seems like that leading factors that played into that coming into my life was also part of the adversity that I didn't actually see. And it had to manifest larger or greater in my life by being told at 29 years old, 6 months after I just got married and sort of heading on the path of the American dream. And I got told that I had this very aggressive form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So that set the course for a whole new way to approach my life, which was, wow, at some point in this process of cancer coming into my life, I did see this as an opportunity for how I've been living inauthentic and how to start to cultivate what does it mean to live more truly and authentic. So that means, to me, to become the author and creator of my life. So I at the time, my oncologist had asked me a powerful question. He said, Dan, how did such a young man such as yourself get into the business of cancer? And that question was so profound that I asked myself internally, and it did. It showed me the ways that I was harming my body. I was self-sabotaging. I was doing all these things that were considered socially normal, but internally they were not in my best interest. And certainly I know at some point, ignorant or arrogantly, I wasn't being the best human being I could possibly be. That's for sure. So especially towards my own self and then towards others in some direct or indirect ways. So I say that the things leading up to the cancer itself was the adversity. The childhood, growing up in a childhood that was fine. It wasn't the best, of course, but it was challenging. My parents separated, and I turned to drinking and drugs and trying to mask my pain. And then that just led to behaviors that amplified into alcohol, and took that into my college education, where it was just a party, so to speak. So I really wasn't diving into learning. And I was distancing myself from who I really wanted to be in the world. So then cancer came into my life, and it was almost as if it was my new life syllabus, was to answer the question that Dr. Lawrence Cloud gave me. Dan, how did such a young man such as yourself get into the business of cancer? And I thought, there's my new purpose in life, is to answer that question, because I could save my soul and maybe help a lot of people along the way. So I had to go through chemotherapy, radiation. I had to go through bone marrow transplants. So that was adversity in and of itself. But for some reason, it didn't feel so difficult as the leading years prior to that was difficult. It was really a strange thing. So it seems like it was designed for me to go through in order to be here with you today and your listening audience today to share the message that living my true authentic self had a lot of impact on me in my behaviors, and those behaviors created problems in my physical body, and obviously it harmed or created problems in my mind as well. Along the way, my relationship with my wife was on turbulent ground because I was focused on my own needs to survive, and then her needs weren't being met. So finally, after 5 years, all this relationship of chemotherapy and going in and out of the hospital, she decided to leave the marriage. And that led me into triggering a bipolar episode, because I'm vulnerable to bipolar depression and mania. So I wound up going into the psychiatric ward eventually because I was suicidal, because I didn't know how to handle the pain. I didn't have any life skills to handle that pain, other than, I guess there must have been some faith in me that just kept me moving forward in some way. And I wound up going into a gun club to try and take my life, which I thought was going to take my life, but it wasn't. It was there to end the pain. So I understand why people commit suicide. It's not because they want to kill themselves. It's because they don't have a life skill to end the pain. So in there, I came to this realization while I was in this gun club. I was going to kill myself, but I couldn't. It didn't happen. But I came to the realization that the answer to my cancer was to self-love myself. And that seems to be the theme that followed all the way along, which was, before cancer, I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't know who I wanted to be in the world or become, other than what my mom wanted me to become. My mom wanted me to become a doctor, lawyer, and engineer. And then I would be seen as being loved or honored or respected by my mom. And of course I did that, but it backfired because it wasn't what I was supposed to be doing. So in this turbulence of time, going through chemotherapy, dealing with the cancer, coming back, going into remission, coming back, and my wife leaving, I wound up trying to kill myself. It didn't happen, but I went into the psychiatric ward because I wanted to learn how to self-love myself, in which case the medical model said, Dan, that's your mental illness talking. We need to get your medication sorted out. And I felt completely societally abandoned about what I felt I needed, and they rejected that. And it led me to anger, a tremendous bitterness, and I'm in lockdown in the psychiatric ward. And in lockdown, I relinquished my rights to my own life. I gave it up to the medical model, and they just didn't listen to me or didn't hear me. And my cancer came back while I was in lockdown, or while I was under their care. Let's use that as a better word, and that was the 6th time I had it. And that was when I met up with what I call life bankruptcy. I just felt so empty. I didn't have my health. I didn't have any identity in the world to go to work, or I didn't have any real love for other people. I was just really self-absorbed in this conflict. So that was the adversity. I don't know how to really sum it up in one thing, but it seems like it was an accumulating effect of somewhere from childhood wounds, childhood neglect that I didn't receive. And I'm not saying I had a bad life. I just didn't have, just wasn't so-called optimal for my childhood development. But all that has led me to who I am today. So was it really that bad, or was it all really in divine plan? And I accept that was all in a divine plan that I didn't have any understanding of, but I'm gaining more understanding each day. So that was the adversity. And I know that you want to probably talk about some of the tools that I might have acquired along the way or used to navigate this kind of adversity.
Sure, but then before we move on to the next question, let's dissect a little bit. So I really appreciate you sharing your adversity, and it was packed adversities, and it's the words that we use, like say in my case, child sex abuse, that itself is heavy. And then people don't understand what's behind that word and the magnitude of the impact that you have. So first of all, let's go back to your childhood. That just to share with you that in Japan, where I grew up, we have a lot of pressure. Of parents want their kids to be such and such, and then that can really self-harm their identity and then dreams. So I just wanted to share that with you, the pressure of their parents wanted their kids to be a certain way, like you said, like doctor, lawyer, and stuff. And then that's really significant. And then also um having a cancer itself is a huge challenge. And then your wife leaving and then going to um, the stage that you have to go through. First of all, I'm very sorry that you have to go through all of these adversities. I just want to ask you, there are a lot of stages that you talked about, but let's go back to your childhood a little bit. So growing up, and then getting into after the separation of divorce, and then to drugs and drinking, like what do you think really happened in terms of your mental health, or maybe psychologically? To You said you used the word masking, maybe what was going on? Do you remember?
The only thing I can remember it was quite chaotic because there was 5 kids and a mom, and my dad left. And in that chaos, my mom wound up going to work. And so I was probably 14, somewhere around 15. And I think it was a very vulnerable time in my development in terms of my emotionality, because I was entering into manhood or whatever. And dad leaving was very significant in some ways. And I never really had a connection to my dad as a father figure, someone that I could lean on for advice or suggestions on the troubles I was having in life. So it felt like my opportunity to have that in my life was missing, especially in that vulnerable period. And I think there was even stressors before that were leading up to him leaving that were also there, that were pretty much I was ignorant to. It was unknown to me that was probably having its effect. Certainly there were things that I remember. I wanted to play drums, and I got a drum set for Christmas at about 11 years old, I think. And then my mom I came home one day to play them and practice on them, and my mom had thrown them out without my acknowledgement. And that really crushed me because it felt like that was a piece of me that I really wanted to play and learn them. And there was no discussion. It was just throw them out. So that had an impact. And I'm sure there were other ones along the way that led to all this impact. So finally, I just didn't have any, I guess, nurturing emotional intelligence, emotional literacy there to help me acknowledge what I was going through. And I think it was because the parents themselves didn't have it. And so they had to deal with their own stuff. So the whole household felt like we were just left to just survive, right? And figure it out. So part of me was, oh, I'm going to go to work. So at 14, I started working, right? And then I got money. And then the people I was associating with, it was quite normal that we were all they were experimenting with cigarettes and pot and various things. And then I dove right into it, and then I felt accepted. So by feeling accepted, I was doing it to feel like I had some peers and a tribe, so to speak. So then we just kept doing the same thing over and over again. And then I created an identity around that as someone that could really party, or someone that could hang with the older crowd, so to speak. And then, it wasn't like I didn't see my parents growing up, and the way they dealt with stress was through alcohol, right? My dad was pretty much an alcoholic his whole life. So it wasn't like I didn't see that. So that probably kicked in as this is how you deal with your problems, not knowing that that's some kind of an emotional wound that isn't being addressed appropriately. So it led all the way through college until finally at 23, I had acknowledged that, geez, the things that I'm doing, something in me, an awareness in me said, wow, if you keep doing this, you're going to become like your dad. And I didn't respect my dad as a father. I certainly gave him respect as a human being, but not as a father figure. And I wrote him a letter, and I explained to him what I was going through. And I said, I don't respect you as a father. I just respect you as a human being, but I want to try and set some kind of relationship up moving forward. And, it just sort of fell on deaf ears, and I realized that at least I had done my part to say, I wanted to become who I want to be. I just don't want to be my dad. I don't want to be like him. So I started to recognize that I had to really let go of the soft drugs, the soft recreational drugs, and then really begin the process of recognizing that drinking was not in my best interest. But it took a while, and it still, even when I got cancer 6 years later, after that letter, I was still having my alcohol, but it was more like not daily. It was more of a binge type, more of a behavioral type of alcoholism, where I would just drink. I would never know when to stop until, I was too intoxicated to drink itself.
Did doctor tell you that your cancer was somehow related to this drug and alcohol usage, or not really? Like what?
No, they never brought up lifestyle factors at all. They basically just said that's a road, it's basically a tumor, and you have to cut, burn, or poison it out of you. They don't look at life. This was back in 1994, 95, 96, all the way to 2000, that they never looked at lifestyle factors or environmental factors, right? The psychological environment, the physical environment, the chemical environment that we're in. They don't look at those things because they're just looking at a very narrow view of cancer. What I like to say is they look under a microscope, and they see it, but they don't see the person that has the microscope. And they don't back out and look at it from a telescope and see, well, how is this person living? So they really narrow their view because they have a product and service that serves their narrow view, right? But if they expanded it back, they don't have a product or service that supports the larger picture of the human being that's experiencing this, and they're experiencing this for some reason. And that was the way I started to approach it, because I got that powerful question from my doctor. how did I get into the business of cancer, was, wow, it wasn't because I didn't take enough drugs growing up. I didn't get enough chemo as a baby. That doesn't answer the question. And, so if it doesn't answer the question in my engineering mindset at that time, if it doesn't answer the question, it can't really truly cure it at the root cause.
Well, I really appreciate that. So I want to move on a little bit about the cancer treatment. So you had the chemotherapy and the radiation. You had a surgery as well, correct?
Correct.
How was the process of going through all of that?
I just felt like it was kind of like an athletic endeavor. It was kind of like it was like, just show up and put your time in. I did get one doctor had said, Dan, it's 90% showing up. I mean, it's 10% showing up, 90% mental. And I really loved that because I felt like I just had to go through it, right? The first round of chemotherapy was 8 months long. It was a standard protocol, 50% chance of getting you 5 years. Okay. So I went through it just like you would go through college. How do people go through college? Or how do people go through medical school with all the challenges they face? You just get up and you do it. And I had my wife at the time there. So my wife was a great source of fuel and in regards to wanting to go through these things. So I give an example of if a soldier goes to war and he leaves his family behind, let's say he leaves his wife behind, he takes a picture and he's on the battlefield. If he's dying, he always says to his soldiers or mates, look, please tell my wife I love her, or please tell my mom I love her. So there's this thing that fuels us, this human love, we might call it, that can fuel us through adversity. And it could also be a future self that we want to become that can be a source of inspiration that is written about in Man's Search for Meaning by, his name, the author's name doesn't come to mind, but Man's Search for Meaning shows about the Holocaust and that people that saw their suffering as having bigger purpose and meaning for their life were the ones that made it, and they were able to actually reclaim their dignity when they were freed from the Holocaust. But those that didn't see purpose and meaning and were bitter about it, then they were the ones that suffered and they were never able to come back into their own dignity and humanity. So I think that was part of what I was doing is that I was just navigating that this desire to be in life and finally anchoring in that I love life for life itself. Like life doesn't have to give me anything in order for me to be in love with life.
So let's actually talk a little bit about divorce, because you had this support during the chemotherapy, like you mentioned. How did your wife break the news that she wanted to divorce you?
Well, this was the challenge. I found subtle messages throughout her behaviors that led me to believe she was leaving me for another man. And then I was really, really scared and really bitter and jealous and anger and all these emotions that I probably had as a child that I couldn't process properly are all coming to a head in this one particular event. Even though a part of me was also trying to say, hey, let's work it out. So there was that conflict between the bitter, jealous part and the part that said, hey, let's work this out. So I called her out on it. And really, she denied it initially. And then finally it came out, and at that point, it wasn't like she didn't want to work on our marriage. She didn't want to work it out. She just wanted to leave, and that was her stress speaking to her and her shortcomings or whatever she had to deal with. And then I had to sit with her decision. That was her choice, but I had to sit with that. And I really sat down and I said, Dan, why am I suffering for her choices? Everyone has the right to make choices, even if they're difficult on my behalf. And I said, I'm suffering because I put my happiness in her. So what I had done is I had projected that she was my happiness and that that story of the heroic soldier saying, hey, I love my wife during battle. It feels like I had put so much pressure on her to be my happiness during this adversity, but I also put her in responsible for my unhappiness. And I realized part of my healing was that I'm going to have to learn how to be responsible for my happiness and my unhappiness and not project that onto other people. And that could be another childhood wound that I felt responsible for my parents' happiness and unhappiness, right? And that's being projected out. So now here it is coming up for me to heal it. And I had this awareness again, this consciousness that came in and said, wait, why are you suffering for her choices? She has the freedom to make choices. And that's when things changed. And I said, I have to learn how to be happy for who I want to be in the world. And that led me down the path of studying happiness. But I was in conflict with this jealousy and all this wounds trying to come out, that it led me to that bipolar episode and into the psychiatric ward.
So when you said after your wife left earlier, and then you were suicidal and you were depressed, and then you mentioned that you got locked down or locked up or something, the psychiatric
Yeah,
place.
when you check yourself into the psychiatric ward, you relinquish your right to life for 7 days. They're responsible for your life because they're saying that you deem yourself a threat to yourself or others. And so when you go in, you can't leave until 7 days, for at least 7 days. And they tell you when you can leave.
That is so awful. That is just so awful.
Yeah.
And did they medicate you? Did they force you to medicate yourself?
Well, they gave me medication, but I didn't take it. I realized that they were offering me fear-based medicine, so I didn't want to take it. And I wanted to learn how to self-love myself. I didn't want to take medications. It wasn't working. It brought me to suicide. It wasn't supporting what I really truly need. And if my true needs are met, then healing takes place. So I navigated myself out of that particular situation by asking a nurse one night. I said, look, what do I do to get out of here? And he goes, just tell them what they want to hear. In other words, well, you're an actress, act your way out. And I said, okay, all right. I've been an actor my life, just faking it till I make it. So sure enough, I just started to just kick into gear, like just doing all the activities that I was required of. And even on a side note, they took my supplements away. They wouldn't let me take supplements, or my protein powders or something that I thought would support my physical body. It was just a strange place to be in. It really was. I don't know what to say. Maybe it has helped a few people. I don't know. For me, it saved me in some way, right? In an indirect way, it said, hey, this is not my way. This is not who I want to be. This is not my medicine. This isn't medicine for my soul. So I have to leave this place. So I finally got out in 7 days. But as I mentioned, 2 days into it, I had my terminal cancer come back for just raging. And that's when I went home and I said, I'm going to take care of this. They don't know how to do it. So, and then after I went home, 5 months later, I got rid of all the tumors.
So let's dive into the second question, which are the tools. You kind of mentioned a little bit here and there, but let's just really dive into what really worked for you and then your adversity. So Dan, before you answer that, I just want to mention this is one of my most empowering part of the podcast so far, of the episode 84. This one is each guest who had been through significant adversities, they have shared really life-saving, empowering messages and methods that usually people don't talk about or share. So what do you think multiple adversities that you experienced, some of the tools that you use that really saved you?
Well, it feels like a loaded question because I know a lot of people want a practical how to, like just do this, this, and this, and you'll be saved. I don't think it's that simple. I really wish it would be. The thing I came down to is that nutrition and movement were the two principles that I needed to really focus on. was how do I nourish the self that I want to be, and how do I move across the plane of this planet so that it's nourishing. I didn't have a lot of energy to give to the world, so I had to really find my way to get nourished and to move my body, because those are the two things that need to be done, right? So that's the general principle, is nourishment and movement. And I'm not talking just physical movement. I had to move my ideas, my imagination, my tears. I had to move my bowels. I had to move. But in a practical sense, food played a real big role. I think that's an elephant in the room, is the food that I eat and the food that I choose to eat and how I eat it. It was a really big role play. And that meant that at that time in 2000, when I left the psychiatric ward, I started the process of helping to heal my digestive system. Right. But which I guess you could call it a tool, but it seems like it's a how-to. I like the principles as the tools, because it's how you use the tool that makes a difference. So I did have mentors, because I was studying health. Since 1995, I was studying health, and I was taking my body apart and I was taking my mind apart to put it back together, just like an engineer would do with anything, an engineering mindset, just take it apart. And I had a mentor, and I told him my experience at the gun club and at the psychiatric ward, and he suggested a gentleman, a doctor, that had put together a protocol for reestablishing the microbial community in your digestive system. And that was the first step. That was my first starting point. And I would think that the second, right tied in with there, if I'm in doubt, I had to reach out to someone else. So I think the ability to be vulnerable, a tool, is to be able to reach out to someone, like to feel safe with someone enough that you could reach out for some guidance. You might call it a mentor, you might call it, someone that you can trust, that you could get appropriate guidance. So that was a tool, right? And I accessed that, and I applied the principles of what the book this Dr. Webster had shared, and I felt a little bit of hope. And I don't know if hope is a tool, but it certainly is the result of using the tools. And hope is really powerful in terms of motivating and keeping me to stay focused or to stay on track. And it has its own, I think it has its own healing medicine once you tap a little bit of hope. So that summer of 2000, I started to use my imagination, that I had to purify my body, because I had been through so much chemotherapy and radiation and stuff like that. I felt it was very toxic. So that was a very starting point, was how do I detoxify not just my body, but then how do I clean up my environment that I was in? And I was living with my mom. So I started to just clean her house and repair things, visioning, using my imagination, that I was doing that to my body. So even her car was a mess. She was a smoker, so there was a lot of cigarettes in the ashtray and all around. I was like, wow, I just cleaned her car out. I'd wax it, and I would pretend that that was me, through what I considered the law of interconnection, that we're connected to everything that's in our environment and everything around us. So if I'm helping my environment, I'm helping me. And I think that's what we come back full circle about, the doctors not taking a bigger picture look at a person's environment that they're in. It's a very important issue. And so I started cleaning up that environment that summer, and I started cleaning myself up. And I just remembered I had to remain, in a sense, not only humble, but to activate my virtue of humor, like to be able to laugh at myself and everything that's going on. I joined a bowling league with my sisters. We played bowling once a week that summer. So there was some social integration. And just moving forward, I don't know if that's a tool, but maybe you could help, through your work and through your experience, what that might be as a tool. But my own sense of who I was at that time, I was willing to just keep accessing that and living that way. So nutrition and movement. So the bowling was movement. It was social interaction. I had some mentors. it all came back to, how do I nourish myself and how do I move? How do I move?
And you mentioned about self-love earlier too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, self-love is the act of reaching out to actually feed yourself well, to take a rest, to sleep when you're tired. Self-love is calling someone that you can trust. Self-love is listening to this podcast, right? Because it's representing a piece of who you might want to be in the world. It's so an act of self-love is anything you do that brings you towards who you want to be in the world and become. And another act of self-love is saying no to the things that will take you away from that, right? Self-control or letting go. And some of those are painful to let go of certain things, right? And if self-love is another way of saying more autonomy, more personal freedom to express yourself cleanly and fully. And self-love could be a sense of authenticity. And that honesty is not something you just say, hey, I'm going to be honest right now. Honesty is something that you just are. You could just be honest now. You don't have to hold a social mask to hide the lies, right? So self-love could be that's why I consider it the number one tool. And it's the number one benefit too of using the tool, is that it kind of fuels itself. And then you'll be able to tell who's really in your circle of influence, because when you start to self-love yourself, you're going to become someone that you aren't or haven't been. And you're going to wind up losing some people in your social circle because they want you to be who you used to be, and they don't give you the room to grow into who you want to become. So just be mindful that if you start to self-love yourself, you're definitely going to have to let go of a number of people, places, and things that no longer serve you, so that you can make room for what does really serve you at the heart level and at the soul level.
Well, thank you so much for that. So my last question, if you say in maybe one word or one sentence, what's the gift that came from your adversity?
Cancer taught me how to live, and divorce taught me how to love.
Well, thank you very much for the answer, and thank you for sharing your story with us today. And I hope that our listener can get something out of this conversation, and they can survive and use this platform as something that they can really get hope and self-love and learn something from us. Thank you so much, Dan, again, for being here today.
Okay, Juri, thank you so much.
Thank you.